I entered my study abroad experience here with few expectations due to my previous experience spending 3 months in Thailand. Although my experience ended up being amazing, it was so unbelievably different from the images I'd had in my head going into it prior. And that in turn made my transition more difficult. So I decided to start off with an attitude of minimization. We are all people. We are so similar at our core, and although cultural differences are important, they can all just be either overcome or understood at the end of the day, right? But in my lack of anticipation, I was ironically unable to prepare for how the discrepancies in communication between individuals and lifestyle differences would actually affect, frustrate me, and also educate me in my time here. When it came to differences in cultural values, the first to immediately present challenges was chronemics. In Ghana, time is polychronic, meaning it is more relaxed, less driven by punctuality, and based on much more humanistic flow than the US's preferred ticking hands on a clock. Finishing a conversation rather than arriving to class on time was prioritized. I couldn't understand this philosophy due to my own imprinted individualistic values that emphasize personal progression rather than community adhesion. I'm still working on striking a balance between being too early and being too late. I've had to relearn the code of what on time means, but also when situationally to use it. I've missed opportunities by being too comfortable with Ghanaian time, but I've also been left waiting for hours or in uncomfortable situations because of it. I've had to learn to be less impatient and be okay with waiting, to take it less as a personal offense and lack of respect for my time. The second major difference I failed to anticipate came in the avenue of power differences, particularly in terms of relationships to authority figures. I felt that in Ghana, despite informalities such as greeting, power distances were smaller than in the US. There was a lack of rigid professionality between teachers and students, bosses and employees. Teachers showed up to class as late as their latest students, and they failed to communicate with students in what I consider to be a timely fashion. At my internship, taking a 2-hour lunch break and taking a nap on the job was acceptable, and WhatsApping your supervisor about the smallest questions when he was out on the field doing actually important work was just fine. Although this informality was new to me and I felt major frustrations in terms of timeliness and effective communication, there were also so many bright sides. My boss was always available and happy to help with assignments. I found myself having meaningful conversations with coworkers that I'll never forget, and asking seemingly dumb questions or requesting for extensions were met with a positive response I was not used to. In fact, when my laptop broke down with much of my work from previous months on it, my boss even offered to help me get it fixed and told me not to worry about it. I felt the humanity was injected back into these systems, although that isn't to say I still didn't deal with many challenges in my effort to adapt. Lastly, my transition into the clearly defined spaces of my Ghanaian host family was one that I thought I'd been prepared for, but was really quite a learning experience. Back home growing up, it had really just been me and my mom, and since an early age I'd been used to coming home to an empty home, not having food prepared for me, and not having to ever report where I'd be or when I'd be back at the house. The first few weeks, I felt I was living in the lap of luxury. I had my own room and bathroom, my laundry was being done for me, my meals were being prepared for me, and although being cared for to this extent was refreshing, it also became quite restricting and overbearing at times. I found that having so much done for me made me feel constantly surveyed, and I felt like I was looked at as unable to be independent. I also found it frustrating that I had to actually estimate when I would leave home and return. Luckily, Ghanaian time helped ease the rigidity of those expectations. I also was just simply not used to being social in my own home. When guests came, I would be expected to mingle, and although I couldn't at first read their high-context communication patterns, I came to realize that the health of my relationships with family came down to how much time I spent playing with my host nephew or sitting out by the shop at night eating and chatting with my host parents and sisters. Especially as someone who finds idle time to be frustrating in itself, I found myself having to manage when I could fit in these times of bonding. But the beauty of this experience is that although I was still a guest in their home, I felt actually a part of the family. I was cared for when sick or when in unsafe situations, and even if it felt overbearing at times. I was given intimate opportunities I would have never expected, such as being a bridesmaid in my host sister's wedding. I was even referred to by my host father as their last-born at times. Overall, Ghanaians have taught me so much about life, and this class has taught me a lot about who I am at my core. I've learned not to sweat the small stuff, particularly when it comes to rigidity and planning. On that same vein, I've realized that connecting with people and living in the moment is a skill I've had to practice coming from such a high-stress and pressure-filled environment, but that it's really rewarding. Being late, I've found, is a small price to pay for the relationships I've nurtured. This especially includes being part of a more traditional family unit and feeling a degree of support and care that I never expected to have here. I found that it takes letting go in order to shave off some of my individualistic American tendencies and allowing myself to become a part of a community. That being said, however, I am still me. I came into this class as a soc major, intent on the idea that we are purely products of our surroundings and our intersections, and that none of our qualities can be retained when life-altering experiences happen. But being here and identifying some of the behaviors I have that I'm unable to compromise for the sake of immersion has taught me to admit to my levels of polarization. That there are parts of me that will always be integral to me, like my low-context communication style or my need for alone time and independence. This line of thought has made me more confident in myself, and ironically more aware of and comfortable in my limits when it comes to my overarching goal of attaining acceptance and adaptation.